the kind of theoretical basis underlying this talk comes from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a geographer, and the idea of racial capitalism, that capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. And so I think redlining and the legacy it's left that continues to modern day gentrification is an example of how capitalism takes on a racial component that gets built into the physical landscape of the city. So this is a more modern rendering of those historical redlining maps that I started off with. This map was created by actually a student of mine at DePaul, Chris Silber, and you can it's searchable, so you can actually put your address in and see how where you live would have been coded in those historic redlining maps. And so what's interesting about this is the role that the redlining maps played in two ways. One is how it recognized the existing racial geography of the city, right? But also the ways in which, because it kind of froze those racial geographies in time, that it made them true, right? That maps and other mortgage banks and other institutional actors, including the city itself, acted upon the redlining map as though it were fact, right? So it made the map true, right? That what this started, what the redlining map started, was a whole cycle of disinvestment that the legacy of which we continue to see today. And what that meant in terms of community and neighborhoods and how they were able to develop and grow, or not, as the case may be, right? So that the inability to get any sort of mortgage financing for properties in the areas that were mapped as red, and also overwhelmingly the areas that were mapped as yellow, not only meant that certain people were locked out of the privilege of home ownership, and overwhelmingly, of course, Black Americans were locked out of the privilege of home ownership, but that even for those who did own properties, that they would not be able to appropriately maintain those properties because it would be impossible to get any sort of refinancing in order to engage in property upkeep. So it basically manufactured ghettos, right? And manufactured the neighborhoods we understand, again, even into today, to be quote unquote bad neighborhoods. It also led to the rise of Chicago invented the process of contract selling, wherein people would sell property to African Americans and also be the lenders, right? So it would go outside of the official banking system. And then so that did give people the opportunity at home ownership. The problem was that it tended to be at rates that were often triple the cost of what that housing was actually worth on the open market. But because Black people were shut out of the traditional mortgage market, they had no choice but to pay more for their properties. And that when contract sellers sold for these exorbitant prices, they also tended to cover up major repairs that might be needed on the building, ways in which it hadn't passed inspection, or various other things that made the maintenance and upkeep of these properties very expensive. And how contract selling works, and again, contract selling has not gone away. We're starting to see a spike in contract sales continue in the current economic climate, was that if people missed just one payment, the seller would seize the property back and the buyer would have lost every penny that they put into investing into that property. So UIC actually did a recent study of the effect that contract selling had on the Black community in Chicago, and they estimate that between $3.2 and $4 billion of wealth was stolen from the Black community during this time when contract selling was at its height. So that legacy continues to the present day, right? That the history of what that meant for buildings and communities is still very much visible in Chicago's landscape, and determines not just the kind of status of neighborhoods, but of course the racial makeup of neighborhoods. And this is hard to see anyway, but for obviously those of you who are familiar with Chicago don't even need the legend to this map to know what the color dots mean, right? That whites are represented by the purplish dots, Latinx by the orange dots, and Black by the blue dots, right? So that the way in which the racial geography of Chicago very much maps onto the redlining map. And again, this is a modern demographic map, but it maps onto that historic the historic legacy provided by those original redlining maps. Here's another one. I just happened to see this on Twitter relatively recently. The idea, this is about COVID tests, but the point here is that Chicago continues to have only one map, right? That those racial patterns map onto so many other different things, right? We can map, you can map the location of check cashing places versus the location of banks onto that old redlining map. The incidence, obviously, of COVID, which is a huge issue right now, as well as in this map, the incidence of who is getting the vaccines for COVID. But a whole host of housing issues, crime issues, school closures, a bunch of other things track onto the racial geography that is the legacy of those original historic redlining maps. And here's yet another one that starts to get us at our topic for tonight, which is gentrification. This is from DePaul's Institute for Housing Studies, mapping high, moderate, and low income neighborhoods in Chicago. But here again, you can see, since I've already showed you the racial demographic maps for the city, that the racial construct of the city maps very closely onto what are high, middle, and low income neighborhoods. And in this map, the neighborhoods that are in kind of the darkest shade of the respective colors of red, green, and blue are the neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification. And this is another map that, again, Chicago continues to have only one map. This is from a relatively recent WBEZ study of bank lending in Chicago, which once again shows, similar to the era of redlining in the 1930s, that mortgage lending is happening overwhelmingly in white neighborhoods on the north side of Chicago, and that Black and brown neighborhoods on the south and west sides are underserved by the banking community. And it's very hard to get any sort of investment financing for property or much of anything else for that matter on the south and west sides. And that again is explicitly racialized. And so here's where gentrification comes in. So these pictures are drawn, for the picture on the left is from what is proposed to be El Paseo in the Pilsen neighborhood. And on the right is a rendering of Mural Park, which is, again, supposed to be, this is a rendering, not an actual site, but proposed to be high-end office space along El Paseo. And so the difference between these two pictures in terms of property values and income is what we call the rent gap in gentrification theory, right? That gentrification is attracted or occurs in areas of the city where there is a demonstrable gap between the existing land value and the potential land value, right? So that gentrification therefore builds upon, quite literally builds upon, the existing inequalities of the city, which again, we cannot separate from the racialized inequalities of the city. That gentrification looks for areas of the city that have a certain innate value. So for example, location close to the urban core, access to public transportation, or access to highways or other means of transportation, historic architecture, and access to other amenities in the city, some of which, of course, were not always considered amenities. So, for example, location along the Chicago River, which was actively considered a bad thing during the industrial heyday of the city. Now that the river has been cleaned up to a certain extent, now that is an amenity to be valued. Right. And so you're seeing high-end condo developments along the Chicago River that will have a kayak launch, for example, right, which is something that was unimaginable 50 years ago or even 30 or 20 years ago. So that gap between the existing and the potential land use, those are the places to which capital is attracted. And so those are the places which were historically redlined. Right, part of the reason, as I alluded to earlier, that certain neighborhoods become areas of disinvestment is simply because they cannot get access to any sort of mortgage financing or really investment of any sort, right? The legacy of the redlining maps is not just about mortgage financing, but is about all the other kind of institutional actors that choose not to invest in certain neighborhoods because they are actively devalued, right? So it's not just about mortgage financing and banks not locating in particular neighborhoods, but it's about the city itself abandoning certain neighborhoods, closing down schools, as we've seen recently, limiting public transportation, limiting garbage pickup, limiting police presence and fire presence. This was something we especially saw in the 1970s in most major American cities, where the policy was called planned shrinkage. That in a time of fiscal crisis, as the 1970s were, and of course, as we are seeing now again, the city thought that it could not kind of fund all of its neighborhoods. And so they decided to for all intents and purposes, abandon certain neighborhoods and to retreat in terms of their public investments in those areas. Those neighborhoods tended to be the same neighborhoods that experienced disinvestment as a result of their racial geographies and where they were in those historic redlining maps. So that kind of legacy of disinvestment continues across decades and generations. And gentrification, some see as a reversal to that pattern of inequality, right? That it is a return to the city. Gentrification has often been referred to as a return to the city movement. And to some extent, that may be true, but really what we see is not so much a return to the city of investment from, say, the suburbs or from other cities, but rather kind of a shell game within the city of what is the next neighborhood that's going to be considered the hot place to be, right? Where is the next kind of speculative investment going to pay off? And that geography is constantly shifting. But what gentrification is looking for is, again, where that return on investment is going to be highest. And so it has to look for marginal neighborhoods, right? To invest in the Gold Coast, you may make a profit, but it's not going to be a profit of hundreds of percentage points, right? Whereas if you take a neighborhood like Pilsen, as the example I show here, where, up until even 15 years ago, you could have purchased a property that was maybe a single family home for, say, between $70,000 and $100,000, knock it down, and because of the existing zoning, build a 3 to 4 story condo without needing any kind of zoning change, and be able to sell each of those units for $300,000 or more. That's an incredible profit potential, right? That already established neighborhoods are not going to have that kind of increase in profits. And so that's what draws gentrification to certain areas. And rather than being a kind of new development that reverses the historic inequalities at the urban core, it builds upon those existing inequalities. So again, take, for example, Pilsen, but there are other examples within Chicago of neighborhoods that were for many years considered not necessarily attractive places to invest because they were heavily industrial neighborhoods, right? Well, with deindustrialization, areas that had previously been industrial, and I want to highlight that there are many neighborhoods in Chicago that are still actively industrial. It's still an important part of the city's economy, and that Pilsen itself still has a bunch of active industry and a PMD. But broadly speaking, formerly industrial spaces are now considered attractive, right? They're loft space, it's attractive to artists or people who want to be artist adjacent. And so rather than doing anything to undo the inequalities that the industrial city built into the urban landscape, gentrification capitalizes on those inequalities. It takes spaces, so again, like communities of color, immigrant neighborhoods, industrial neighborhoods, that had been systematically devalued and disinvested, and finds ways to make them marketable and attractive again to a population of people who, as the workforce and the nature of work has changed, are attracted to living and working in the city center in a way that was not true in the 50s and 60s, right? Whereas suburbs used to be considered where the frontier of profitability and opportunity was, now the kind of next hot neighborhood within the urban core is where the frontier of profitability has moved. And so people are more likely to be both living and working in the center of the city, and that younger people, millennials, whatever you want to call them, are less attracted to the 90-minute commute in both directions to the suburbs than their parents would have been, right? Where we see kind of opportunity happening for a certain population has shifted, and that access to all that the urban has to offer, which again always existed in these neighborhoods in terms of the physical proximity that they have, now can be capitalized upon because investment is available in areas where previously it had been denied. And so here's an example. Again, this is taken from Pilsen. You can probably guess by now that I have done a lot of work in Pilsen over my now 16 years, almost 17 years in Chicago. But this is an example of what I was talking about in terms of the rent gap, right? That you see on the left, a historic house. Pilsen has some of the oldest housing stock in the city of Chicago. Some survived the Great Fire. Housing that does not necessarily show any signs of major improvements over the course of its history, again, because of that inability to get mortgage financing over the course of its history, being a very profitable endeavor to buy buildings like that, knock them down, and then to build much larger scale buildings for either market rate rentals or for condominiums. And so the price differential between these two property uses is what brings speculators to certain neighborhoods. And there is, this is a concerted effort. This doesn't happen accidentally. It's not just about individual homeowners or renters, quote unquote, discovering a neighborhood that is newly affordable to them, that gives them the access to urban amenities they want. This is about capital, as in partnership with the city, looking for neighborhoods across the urban landscape that are now considered to be good places to invest, that would not have been considered safe places for investment even 20 years ago. I teach a class at DePaul on Pilsen, where we collect a whole bunch of property data to look at the effects that gentrification is happening, the effects that gentrification is having on the neighborhood. And so we look at property ownership and property taxes and recent sales and demolitions and the condition and the use of the building. And years ago, I had a student in that class whose father was a real estate developer. And she told me, she had been sharing with her dad what she was working on. And she said that he said that is exactly what they do before they decide on what new neighborhoods to invest in, right? So this is a concerted effort to look at what is going to be a potentially profitable place to invest. And that is very much about the place and not necessarily investing in the people who are there. So one of the arguments that you will hear about gentrification is that cities look better when they're gentrified, or neighborhoods look better when they are gentrified. And that may be true. But the question is, are the people who were there for the long run, who suffered through the disinvestment of previous decades, are they able to benefit from that new investment? And overwhelmingly, the answer to that question is no, right? That we see in the process of gentrification, a whole host of displacements. And indeed, displacement is central to the definition of gentrification. It is about replacing existing populations with new higher income populations, higher income land uses. So overwhelmingly what we see is, first of all, the displacement, especially of long-term renters, who are no longer able to afford, especially in cities that don't have any kind of rent control or stabilization. And so where that protection for renters is absent, so we see renters displaced. We can even see long-term homeowners displaced because of rising costs in maintaining a home. So a strategy we've seen in a number of cities is the increased enforcement of building codes in gentrifying neighborhoods, wherein long-term homeowners who don't have the same access to capital to upgrade and maintain their property are targeted for building code enforcement, and that the cost of the fines that they accrue from not being able to keep the building up to code is the kind of the stick that finally displaces them from their homes. Another way in which we see long-term homeowners being displaced from their neighborhoods is the increase in property taxes. So one of the things that my students routinely research is how property taxes have changed over time in Pilsen. And in the mid-2000s, property tax increases in Pilsen tended to be between 60 and 90%. So again, if you're a long-term homeowner, especially senior homeowners on a fixed income, that is not a cost that you are going to be able to deal with, right? And so increased property values, which theoretically should be a good thing for property owners, right? Because if you have a higher property value, then if you want to sell your property, you'll make more money. But if you actually want to stay in and live in your property and the property taxes go up, all of a sudden that home becomes unaffordable to you. So we have those kinds of physical displacements that result from gentrification, but there are also a whole host of more kind of social displacements, right? That new businesses open up that cater to gentrifiers and not to long-term residents. So whether that is, very upscale coffee shops, different bakeries, different restaurants, different clothing stores, where people are made to feel unwelcome, even in their own neighborhood. And again, often there is a racial dimension to this, not to mention the long-term local businesses who, when their customer base gets displaced from the neighborhood, they then also find it difficult to survive. And then there are all the host of new kind of neighborhood groups that may come into creation in gentrifying neighborhoods that come to take on the voice of quote unquote the community, while ignoring many long-term activists and community organization who have worked for decades to improve neighborhoods. And often indeed it is the work of these community activists that have made these neighborhoods more attractive to gentrifiers and to investment capital in the first place, right? Neighborhoods who have fought against their school closures and the closures of firehouses, and for more frequent public transportation, and for better schools, and a whole host of other, and safer streets. So that in some gentrifying neighborhoods, long-term activists are actually the ones being displaced, even as their work is what helped to make the neighborhood better and, quote unquote, better and more attractive to investment capital in the first place. And so that leads many people in gentrifying neighborhoods to ask, now that the neighborhood is nice, why do I have to move, right? So a lot of the kind of language around long-term residents in the rhetoric of gentrification has blamed long-term residents for their neighborhoods being disinvested, right? People have been, the assumption of many gentrifiers and developers and speculators has been that neighborhoods are poor because the people living in them don't care about them, when in reality, neighborhoods are poor because they don't have access to capital. And that is a long-term problem. That is a problem that is outside the ability of individuals to fight it. And it is a problem that is very highly racialized in American cities. So what good, for long-term residents, the question is, what good does gentrification serve if the benefits that supposedly come with it are not accessible to the people who have been there for a long time? And you'll notice, Chicago watchers, that this picture was taken along the 606, which is a prime example of the kinds of ways in which gentrification is happening in neighborhoods, in ways in which, taking things that had previously been sources of disinvestment, like an unused rail line, and turning it into a neighborhood amenity, and a lot of money going into that, money that is available to developers that was never made available to long-term homeowners or renters. And that when we see kind of massive public investment in things like the 606, other examples coming down the pike, Lincoln Yards, the 78, right, where huge amounts of public money have gone into making neighborhoods more developed. people in disinvested neighborhoods asking, how come this, money funding at this scale has never been available to us? Why is it only when it is very clearly directed at an upper income, overwhelmingly white population that we see the city and investment capital and speculators and developers stepping into neighborhoods, all of a sudden interested in neighborhoods where people have long been looking for resources, have long been building up communities, and that work going unseen and unacknowledged, so that people have to suffer through that disinvestment. And again, that when neighborhoods, quote unquote, turn around, they are the first ones who are forced to leave. And so I'll wrap it up with this picture related to, that a whole host of things kind of come together in this picture, which is why I'm closing here. That this is from a Black Lives Matter march that, as you can see from some of the signs in the crowd, occurred right after the murder of George Floyd. And the way in which these things are linked, right? The police brutality, the displacement of Black families due to gentrification, right? That the legacy of racial discrimination and segregation in Chicago is so deep that there is really no aspect of life that is not touched by it, right? These things are intimately related, because another way in which we see gentrification happening in urban neighborhoods is with increased policing, right? That, which again, for some people, an increased police presence will be read as making a neighborhood safer. But obviously for Black and brown youth, especially male youth, that is not necessarily the case. And increased policing is part of how people are made to feel uncomfortable and even endangered in their own neighborhoods. So that legacy of racial segregation is built into every layer of the urban fabric, and gentrification builds upon that existing system of inequality, and that's why gentrification is something that should be contested rather than celebrated. So I'll stop it there, and because I want us to have plenty of time for questions.
Yeah,
I'll just go to our last slide though.
And thank you, Dr. Curran. We actually do have a number of questions, and so I will have those go. And then if anyone has additional questions, please put them in the Q&A and/or the chat. So the first question is around community reinvestment. And doesn't the Community Reinvestment Act force geographic lending practices?
Technically, it does. But in terms of actual enforcement and what that has meant in terms of, it says, that banks have to lend in any neighborhood in which they are located. So there's a couple of problems with that. There is still plenty of urban neighborhoods that don't have a bank, right? That especially in the south and west side of Chicago are seriously underbanked. And you'll see it's available if you were in the mood to Google maps of where check cashing locations are in the city of Chicago. You will see that they are overwhelmingly concentrated on the south and west sides because people are underbanked. So the Community Reinvestment Act didn't fix that. But even in areas where banks are located and so therefore they should be lending, they're lending a little bit here and there, but they are taking in much more money from the communities in which they are located, in Black and brown communities, than they are lending out. And there has been, the level of enforcement of the CRA varies wildly depending on political administrations. And so that enforcement piece really has not been there, and banks have been less than enthusiastic on really kind of jumping on the on their kind of corporate social responsibility to be equal lenders in the community.
Also, a question, interested to hear how else Chicago is different from other big cities with regard to redlining and racism policies.
Well, in many ways, Chicago was at what my colleague UIC Pauline Lippman once called the forefront of the rear guard. a lot of the racist policy, a lot of policies that become national kind of redlining segregationist policies are actually invented in Chicago. So I mentioned contract selling earlier. That's a classic example. A lot of the ways in which Chicago really concentrated its public housing in primarily Black neighborhoods and made it very explicitly, you know, this is white public housing, this is Black public housing. That is about as extreme in Chicago as you will see as anywhere else. And you know, other cities took a more sort of geographically diverse and also racially diverse, although there's obviously plenty of segregation, racial segregation in public housing across the country, but Chicago really was kind of the ne plus ultra of public housing segregation.
We have a thanks, Win, for a really thoughtful and timely explanation of this process. Can you say a few more words about environmental gentrification?
Gladly, because that's one of my areas of expertise. Thank you, Pat. I think that question's from you. Yeah, so environmental gentrification. So in many ways, I would argue that all gentrification is environmental gentrification in that it's about upgrading the built environment of the neighborhood to increase investment. But specifically, environmental gentrification has been used to refer to cases where, so one of two things happens overwhelmingly. One is that you take a previously heavily polluted area of the city, a brownfield site, and you clean it up. And that the process of cleaning it up obviously boosts property values. And in the process of boosting property values, you displace long-term residents. And so you could argue something like well, it goes both ways. That, you know, the 606 or the Paseo Trail proposed for Pilsen, or Lincoln Yards is a good example here too, right? You take something that had previously been seen as an area that was sort of actively hostile to investment, and all of a sudden you turn it around and you make it attractive to investment. So that's one form of environmental gentrification. Again, that's one that very much happens in previously industrial areas of the city. And then the second form is, which is related, but is the idea of providing an active environmental good, some new amenity. So again, the 606 fits here as an example. The classic kind of global example is that of the High Line in New York City, which again took a disused rail line and turned it into a linear park. And property values surrounding the High Line went up 103% when it was finished. So you can see just, you know, night and day. And so what that does is that those kinds of projects, whether it's cleanup or a new amenity, uses the language of environmentalism and environmental justice to justify market rate developments that end up displacing the people who experienced all the negative effects of that environmental pollution for decades.
I have another, how does spatial deconcentration in Chicago relate to the preservation and sustainability of the Black metropolis National Heritage Area?
Yes, so that's, I mean, that could go both ways. So it's interesting the way in which heritage, so many communities, and especially in the example of the Black metropolis, is the idea of using heritage as a preservation strategy, which makes sense, right? Let's celebrate this history in order to preserve it. And you know, certainly I think there's been some success in that regard so far, but capital is very sneaky and clever. And so when it sees that something is successful in stabilizing an area of the city, it then takes something that it would have considered to be a negative previously. So often in Black and brown neighborhoods, which had previously been considered kind of scary for a lot of real estate investors, once you pick a heritage strategy to celebrate, developers can turn on a dime and all of a sudden they'll be like, yeah, we're totally down with celebrating the heritage of this thing, right? And so I fear that could happen as part of the Black and you see obviously gentrification in Bronzeville, although the scale of disinvestment across the south side of Chicago is so massive that it's going to be a long time before that kind of displacement pressure would happen. But we saw, just as an addendum, that's exactly the strategy that happened in Pilsen. The fact that Pilsen was very strongly seen as a Mexican neighborhood was for many years seen as that's how we were going to save Pilsen, right? That was cited in the gentrification literature as an example of how to stave off gentrification. And so developers went from thinking Mexicans were scary to celebrating like, oh, look at the murals, look at the Aztec sun calendars on the side, and sort of took what had been a preservation communication strategy and turned it into an advertising strategy for the neighborhood.
So on the topic of circling back to environmental gentrification, specifically regarding cleanup of previous brownfields and pollution sites, is the southeast side at risk of gentrification as green spaces like Big Marsh are created? Or is gentrification already actively happening there?
Yeah, I think that's less likely in places like Big Marsh, and in part because, I mean, it's just, you've got this massive territory, right? It's so much space that's been polluted and it's so dirty, right? So that the amount of, you know, where like easily your cleanup, you know, horizon is like 20 to 30 years away at best. But also that the legacy of disinvestment there is not just about this industrial pollution, but of everything, right? I think my prediction is that it will take the provision of a whole lot more amenities in the southeast side to make it sort of gentrification ready, rather than just the physical cleanup of those polluted spaces and turning them into green space. That the scale there is just so massive. It tends to be, because the other thing about gentrification is that it's very spatial, right? The kind of next hot neighborhood tends to be right next to the neighborhood that's hot right now, right? And so like Big Marsh on the southeast side is kind of far away from those hot spots for now.
And the Puerto Rican communities in many cities like Chicago, New York are targets of gentrification. How much would you attribute this to the colonial status of the island?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's the gentrification is a settler colonial process. It's like the new settler colonial process, and it very much builds upon the way in which Puerto Rican communities and of course other Black and Brown communities were just not considered politically relevant. Right, that even that it's not about immigration status; it's simply about the racial hierarchy, that neighborhood, and the language of gentrification. This is very explicit, especially in the 1980s, which is really when gentrification starts to take off. But you still see it today. This language of what's the next frontier for gentrification, right? The people who discover an area are pioneers. Right, that certain neighborhoods you'll even see referred to as being the Wild West. I've even gotten in student papers, not for a long time, mind you, but it's happened where people refer to, when after going to Pilsen, for example, in the early 2000s, when they, would finish a walking tour, they'd be like, "Oh, thank God, a return to civilization," right? So there definitely is that colonial aspect to this, and just basically politically just not taking certain constituencies seriously, and those constituencies not being able to organize enough, both spatially and politically, to be a block against these processes.
Great presentation. With gentrification taking place in Chicago for a long time, what's your opinion about what the future of Chicago looks like? Will it be similar to New York, where higher incomes live in the city center and lower incomes on the outskirts of the city?
Yeah, I hope not. So I'm from New York originally, so I'm very familiar with what that looks like. And I would hope a different future for Chicago, if for no other reason than that Chicago doesn't have access to those same, like Chicago can't be New York, and that's not a bad thing. Right, that Chicago serves a different, that it's not going to be Russian oligarchs driving the Chicago real estate market the way that it is in New York and London, for example. And again, to my mind, that is only a good thing. That I think Chicago's strength is in being the city of broad shoulders and of being a more, kind of working class and ethnic and diverse place. But I fear that our policymakers don't see it that way, right? I think that there are many who do look to kind of big ticket projects, again, like the 78 and Lincoln Yards, and think that development kind of has to come from outside, that it has to be some big ticket, shiny bauble new thing that is where development comes from, rather than from the people and the diversity that are already here, right? Rather than seeing value in what we have and celebrating that, always trying to get in the new thing from outside. And that, I think that's a dangerous strategy for Chicago, because again, it's not the same kind of global city as a New York or a London, and it will be a much more boring city if it becomes. New York is more boring now than when I left it, right? Not just because I left, but like having. So I did my dissertation research, for example, in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, which is kind of like, the poster child for what gentrification looks like. And when I go back now, I can be in that neighborhood that I knew so well, and I can literally get physically disoriented, because it's all, what used to be warehouses and biker bars and cute little old style diners are now 20 to 30 story high rises, right, with Walgreens on the bottom floor. And I don't think anyone would say that that's a better city, right? Clearly there must be something in between, like declining industrial and cookie cutter high rises that all have Walgreens or some other national retailer on the first floor. So I think we actively need. I think that is sorry, I'm being long-winded on this one, but I think that for many urban planners and policymakers, best practice is chase that billionaire, right? Chase the Amazon headquarters, right? But in reality, the best way to actually accomplish urban development is to build upon the strengths that you already have. And Chicago has so many, so there's no reason not to.
A little bit about that, when talking about these mega developments, just asking about the 78 and the potential displacement of residents of Chinatown, for example, and what's the effects on the nearby population of.
Yeah, I think it could be, and obviously residents in Chinatown and Pilsen are really worried, and even the South Loop are really worried about that. That the scale of this is so massive as to just be completely game changing. And the other reason why the 78 is such a good example of how gentrification happens is to show, because the thing that I hate most about kind of the conversation around gentrification in popular culture is this idea that it's inevitable. Right, that's just like, oh, well, when a neighborhood is nice, people are going to want to go there, and then it's going to get expensive, and that's, you can't do anything about it. Well, that's something like the 78 shows you how false that idea of inevitability is, right? That first of all, you need massive rezonings, you need massive investments in public transportation, you need the anchor piece to the 78 is a new is a discovery center for the University of Illinois, right? So that's massive amounts of public money are going into a development to declare it the next big thing, right? And because then we're spending money on those things. We're spending money on a new red line stop for the 78, redoing the streetscape, all these things. Again, the discovery center. Where else could we spend that money? Right. That's instead of saying like, oh, is the 78 a good thing or a bad thing? It's, why do we only want to spend money on these big mega projects? And why do we not look for ways in which, such smaller amounts of money could make such a huge difference in an Austin, an Englewood, a Pilsen, a Avondale, even, that it doesn't take much for people already invested in a community, give them a few resources and they will turn that community around, as opposed to literally putting our energies into building a community from scratch in a place where really no one was particularly demanding it, that I've heard anyway.
There's a little bit follow-up from your last part is what's going to happen in the Austin area, West Side?
Yeah, Austin's so interesting because it's so, again, you can see the spatial, just the how stark the difference is between Austin and Oak Park, right? And so how there's no particular logic to why one neighborhood has to look one way and the other looks so different. But I just don't see a whole lot of attention and awareness on the part of the city of the need to target investment to those areas and to maintain what's there. I think so much of our conversation is about, how do we turn this neighborhood around? How do we turn this neighborhood around? And that there are wonderful things to celebrate in Austin. So let's celebrate those things instead of always looking at what neighborhoods lack. Let's see what they have and then build upon those things.
Definitely. So we're going to go back a little bit talking about kind of a combo question, but can you explain more about the Black Metropolis National Heritage Area? A lot of people are not familiar with the term. And
yeah. Oh, sorry, go ahead. But
okay. And then, there's a kind of follow-up about how Black Metropolis Convention and Tourism and councils can kind of collaborate more effectively to, like, with perhaps DePaul or brand, market Bronzeville, and how are you marketing these as, a destination attraction for tourists and locals alike?
Yeah, so first, let me just say that the Black Metropolis Project is not my area of expertise by any stretch of the imagination. So I don't want to assert something that is not necessarily true, but broadly speaking, it's an attempt to basically see, kind of recognize Bronzeville in a, expansive area as almost like a landmark district. Right. So an area that will be celebrated and ideally preserved in order to both make the history kind of much more visible, and also then to use that history as an economic development tool. And I think that's, there's a danger in sort of the museumification of urban landscapes, right? To see, I don't think there's much point in sort of celebrating the Jazz Age, but then actively displacing Black families today, right? And so that's the fine line that has to be walked with any kind of developments like this. So, and I think Chinatowns are often an example of how this can go, not necessarily always in a great way. And so I'll give more history. So Chinatowns, so we celebrate Chinatowns today often. It's like, oh, look, the diversity and the good food and the blah, blah, blah. And it's often been said, the former alderman in Pilsen, Danny Solis, used to say that he wanted Pilsen to be the Mexican version of Chinatown. Whereas residents in Chinatown were horrified by that because they didn't want their neighborhood to be a place where white people just like dropped in for the night, had a nice dinner, and then left, and didn't actually care about the people or the place or any sense of building community. And also the fact that Chinatown, people forget the reason Chinatowns exist is because of the rampant racial discrimination Chinese immigrants faced in the late 19th century and beyond in American cities, right? Chinatowns are not the creation of Chinese immigrants. They're the creation of white supremacists who would only allow Chinese immigrants to live in certain areas of the city. And the geographer Kay Anderson has done a bunch of work on this. So that to sort of forget the history of discrimination that created the Black metropolis, that creates a Pilsen, that creates a Chinatown, is one of the dangers of the touristification of our ethnic diversity, right? If we're going to celebrate the history, then we really have to look at the seamy underbelly of that history too.
So this is looking ahead 10 to 15 years, Chicago will need tax income 50 to 100% higher than today's taxes. Could one make a case that gentrification is needed to create such a tax base?
Yes, and that is the case that cities absolutely have swallowed. Like that's the Kool-Aid that they have swallowed, right? That gentrification, because gentrification can be very good for city treasuries, right? Property values, you gentrify, property values go up, property tax income goes up. That's the main source of income that cities have control over, right? Other forms of taxes, they have to go through the state, but property taxes is all the city. So increasing property taxes is absolutely good for the city as far as the city is concerned. But my argument would be, can we think of other ways to increase property values besides just increasing property, that through only this way, right? That property values only go up when you gentrify a neighborhood, that again results in the displacement of people who then leave the city, right? And so then you're losing, so granted, maybe they're not millionaires, but they were paying taxes, right? So an interesting thing that's happened to Chicago, even as it gentrifies, is that it's also losing population. And that's not, healthy cities don't lose population. Now, granted, Chicago's not losing like 20% of its population every year. It's only a couple of percentage points. But from the last census, Chicago lost about 200,000 residents, and the overwhelming majority of those were actually children of color, particularly Black children. So basically what that signals is that Black families are leaving Chicago. And again, I don't think that's the sign of a healthy Chicago. So how do we get people to stay? How do we get families to stay? Right? Because the other thing about gentrification being your economic development tool is that there's not a lot of, there's investment in property, but there's not investment in community, right? So many gentrifiers tend to be pretty transient. So you buy a property not because you love the neighborhood, I mean, you like the neighborhood, fine, but you buy it because you consider it a good investment and you're gonna flip it in 2 to 3 years, right? Or you buy it until you have kids, and as soon as your kids are old enough to go to school, you're moving to the suburbs. Or you buy it as an investment property for when you hope your daughter goes to Chicago, goes to University of Chicago, right? Back to New York as an example, much of the property investment in New York is, again, your Russian oligarchs, your Saudi princes, international business people who buy properties just to sit on them. And so you have neighborhoods that are on paper very expensive, but if you walk around them at night, they're deserted, right? There's nothing happening there because no one actually lives there. Property has become just a financial tool, completely divorced from the spaces in which they're actually located. And again, that's not good for any city, in my opinion.
This is a question from Ottawa, Canada. I lived in Chicagoland for much of my life, so it's nice to hear what needs to be called home. So gentrification is very context dependent. In Canada, there are some other takes on it. Rose, for example, takes a feminist lens. Do you see that as applicable in the Chicago context at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And so, just a quick plug. I wrote a book called Gender and Gentrification. So yeah, I'm all over the feminist lens looking at gentrification. So gentrification, so all of this, we've been talking about in financial and explicitly racialized terms, but it's also extremely gendered. Right. So this work of gentrification is masculinist work, right? The idea of cities being all about their profit potential and not about the actual lived use of the city is very masculinist. The people literally doing this work are white men, overwhelmingly, right? So we still have the problem, obviously, in terms of elected officials, maybe not right at this moment in Chicago, but in terms of urban planning departments tend to be very white and very male. The real estate industry is very white and very male. I used to be on the zoning board for my local ward, and I never once did a female developer come before in my over 2 years on that board. One time was there a female architect. There was one female real estate attorney, right? So it's a very masculinist approach to urban space, right? That is looking very much just at the exchange value and not the use value of urban space, but also that the people most likely to be displaced are single mothers, right? That to be a single mother looking for an apartment to rent is just about the unhappiest place to be, right? Landlords discriminate against children. Landlords don't like children, right? They're sticky, they're loud, but they can also potentially bring in more attention from the state, i.e., if children show up with high levels of lead in school, people are going to say, hey, where does that child live? We should test for lead in that building. And landlords don't want the building inspectors coming by testing for lead in their buildings and various other things like that. So so gentrification very much affects those who are most marginalized in society, and in many contexts that will be women. At the same time, women have also acted, early literature on gentrification highlighted the way in which women were major actors in gentrification, because women were you could be single, working in a professional job, earning that level of income and wanting to live close to work. And so that kind of, again, starting in especially in the 1980s, that kind of new category of middle and upper class women who were middle and upper class, not because of who they married, but because of the jobs that they now had access to that previously they would not. But of course then, and those women, those professional women rely on low paid women to do the work that they do, right? So they need the women to clean their houses and cook their food and take care of their children and all these other things. So it's, gender is not just one thing in terms of how it plays out in gentrification, but the process is absolutely gendered in a ton of different ways.
Can you talk about the impact of groups like the Young Lords?
Yeah, so the Young Lords is really interesting. My colleague Ewan Haig at DePaul has done a bunch of work on the Young Lords over time. And I think they were successful for a time in that kind of direct political action, and even also just honestly the kind of scariness of a group of people that some will think of as a gang that has a racialized identity can act as a stop, right, for a period of time. The problem is that it's not permanent. You don't stay scary forever, but that also the capital is constantly changing. And so when you have direct action strategies like the Young Lords, like the Black Panthers, and even plenty of other anti-gentrification groups that have engaged in direct action, that works for a period of time until capital figures out a way to get around it. Right. So whether that is, and often increased policing will be the answer to that question, right? So that it becomes even more dangerous to be Black and brown in these neighborhoods when the police really target an area because they know that investment capital wants to move in and that this group of people is what's stopping that from happening.
Very timely. Do you predict that the global pandemic will slow down gentrification or make it worse?
Yeah, this is the, I can see it both ways. So in one way, obviously, and I think a lot of people are concerned that this means that the pandemic will mean a slowdown for cities going forward, that, we've had lots of upper income people fleeing the city for their second homes or, what have you in the city, and that therefore, and that rents have gone down somewhat. Mm-hmm. If, looking at that data, rents have gone down, but like a minuscule percent, and they've gone down, rents have gone down in extreme high income properties and not in affordable, like rents have not gone down in affordable housing, right? There is not more affordable housing in cities now than there was before the pandemic, full stop. So I don't think that that's what's going to happen. I hope in an ideal world, my hope is that people would see that obviously the level of inequality that COVID has exposed. It's not that it wasn't there before. It's just that COVID has made it so. COVID has really shown the ways in which inequality and racism are literally issues of life and death. That we would choose as a society to do things differently once we can get back to being together in space. My fear is that much like the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9. That this is a great, if you're looking to scoop up properties cheaply, this is a great time to do it, right? That as you have, clearly there's an eviction crisis coming. At some point, the protections that do exist, which again have become spottier and spottier as the pandemic has gone on, there's going to be a wave of evictions that is going to create an opportunity for cash investors, especially and speculators, to scoop up properties in certain neighborhoods and therefore make those neighborhoods more expensive. Even as this might not necessarily even be kind of classic gentrification where it comes with nicer amenities, but simply just charging more because they can, because we perennially just do not have enough affordable housing.
Yeah. This is some sort of practical advice would you give to a millennial who has the funds to buy city property and whose budget is within newly gentrified areas? Any kind of advice, for someone?
Yeah, sure. I get this question a lot, actually, because again, and that's sort of part of the argument that I've wanted to make here in terms of gentrification is that this is not about individual choices, right? Everyone is making choice within a system. Everyone's, well, not the super duper richy rich, but most people's choices are constrained by the market in some way. And so people are just making the best choice that they can. That being said, once you make your choice, then be a good citizen about it, right? And certainly be informed, when you're looking to buy property, just because you can afford a property, we'll look at what did it go for before? Like, what did this sell for last time? Is this a property that's been flipped? Is this a place where a long-term homeowner has been displaced from their property? And try not to add to that, right? Try not to add to that speculative investment, but to sort of understand what is reasonable for a neighborhood and to not pay too much more than that. Again, that's a tricky proposition. But once you decide on the neighborhood that is the right place for you, then be a good neighbor there, right? Participate in the local community organization. Literally say hi to your neighbors. Like there's some people who who don't do that. You know, there are cases, this research has been done in New York, but I think it holds across any gentrified city, where the incidence of noise complaints has gone up to like 311 and even 911, that people are so kind of afraid of their neighbors, especially if they're moving into communities of color, that rather than just like, you know, go upstairs or next door and knock on the door and say, hey, can you turn your music down? They're calling the police, right? And so if that's not being a good neighbor, right? There's that Spike Lee did a great rant. This is many years ago at this point, but so for the Fort Greene neighborhood that his dad was living in, and his father's an acoustic guitarist, and had the police called on him numerous times because of the noise. And he was just like, first of all, this is an older man, right? Just ask him nicely and he'll stop. But also, it's acoustic guitar, right? It's not even electric. Like, how bad could it be? But just that sense of feeling like you are an outsider in the neighborhood, of letting that feeling of being an outsider prevent you from becoming of the neighborhood, talking to your neighbors, and therefore you treat neighbors as though they are hostile to you. If you treat them like they're hostile, then they're going to be hostile, right? So instead, try, what resources do you bring to the neighborhood? How can you be a good neighbor? How can you help to advocate for affordable housing and for good policies that are going to help your neighbors, even if it's not necessarily always the thing that is of immediate financial benefit to you? I think those are all good. You know, in any community group I've been a part of, people who absolutely could be called gentrifiers have been part of trying to solve the problem of gentrification.
You said, thank you for answering the question. It seems to me like developers would benefit greatly from attending these types of workshops and webinars. So we've got one last question, unless anybody else, I'm a bit stuck about how to support the rise of Black wealth, which I think would be at least somewhat focused on ending racist lending practices while discouraging gentrification of Black communities, which might occur as investment rises. Do you have any ideas on this?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, definitely the access to capital really is the biggest barrier. And we've certainly seen that be overcome in some, you know, that we have, you know, within the past 20 years or so, seen kind of the first generation of Black millionaires, and that there actually has been Black gentrification, right? So we see neighborhood, you know, there's some certainly in Bronzeville, Harlem obviously has experienced it. So it's not, you know, race does not prevent you from being a gentrifier, but I think it does make it somewhat more palatable when, you know, people who look like you and maybe can understand, you know, maybe came from a similar neighborhood or even from that very same neighborhood. But this simple fact of kind of sharing the race of the people who live around you does not make you not a gentrifier, right? But how do we build wealth for individuals, but also then build capacity for neighborhoods? And I think that's where Black wealth should be leveraged. And I think, you know, certainly I think there are people who are doing a really great job of that. So Major Carter has done a lot of work in the Bronx of doing what she calls self-gentrifying, like trying to encourage Black entrepreneurship of businesses that might be kind of stereotypically gentrified businesses, but doing it very much for the community, versus, say, you know, a Jay-Z who invested in Atlantic Yards as a development in New York City that includes the new arena for the Brooklyn Nets. I guess not so new at this point, but which displaced a ton of people, and is really a prime example of anti-democratic and simply bad urban planning. But how do we, you know, how do everyone, right? Anyone of any race, how do we use the resources that we have responsibly, right, to build up the communities around us rather than to just suck life from them?
Yeah. So we are at the end of our questions. So great discussion, I think.
Thanks, everyone. Those are great questions.